It had nothing to do with Edward. I could already tell that I'd have to go around my elbow to get to my ass with this lady. I doubted it'd be worth it. It didn't hit me until 1 the next morning as I was lying in Edward's bed, and when it did, it engulfed me with such an instantaneous longing that I couldn't contain myself. I flew out the door and sprang down the staircases, only managing to fall over my own feet once. When I reached the kitchen, my trembling hands found every switch on the walls and illuminated the stainless appliances with a bright fluorescent light. I opened the bottom cabinets, shifting pots and pans too loudly for a house with slumbering individuals, but not in the state of mind to relieve air. I found a large saucepan and threw it aside, a resounding clang reverberating through the room as I repeated it with yet another one. When I realized that what I sought wasn't present, uncontrollable tears stung at my eyes, and my hands worked feverishly to delve farther into the shelves. Just as I'd moved to a parallel cabinet, and my hands began shaking violently with unrestrained eagerness that wasn't being satisfied, I noticed a form out the periphery of my vision. I gasped, lurching back onto the cold tile of the floor, and covered my mouth in shock as I gazed at a very shirtless Carlyle, who stood in the doorway. His sleep-laden eyes squinted in the luminescence of the light, visibly only semi-coherent, as he asked in a voice that was still thick with sleep.
"What on earth is all the commotion down here?"
I might have felt guilty for awakening him and disturbing the peace of the house, if the urgency of my sudden desire wasn't so overwhelming. "Why don't you have a cookie sheet?" I screeched in a frenzied voice that even alarmed me. Carlyle rubbed his eyes in confusion.
"Pardon?"
he mumbled. My chest was heaving with breaths. "A cookie sheet, Carlyle. You don't own any." Somewhere during our exchange, my tears began trailing down my cheeks, and now I was doing everything possible to suppress the sob building in my chest. Just as the urgency of my voice must have finally made him alert enough to respond, as me came barreling into the kitchen, her hair falling in a tangled mess with wide eyes that regarded me in alarm.
"What is it?"
she asked, moving around Carlyle, as he swiftly repeated my accusation of him not owning a cookie sheet. She furrowed her brows at my tear-stained face as I hugged my knees to my chest. "I can't make cookies without a cookie sheet," I clarified in the most pathetic voice that trailed off into a sob. I couldn't understand why I was being so utterly and irrationally ridiculous, but somehow I just needed to make cookies. It was so strong of a craving that I couldn't fathom leaving the kitchen until I did. I relayed this to Esme in the sanest voice I could manage, and stared after her in panic confusion as she fled the kitchen. With much frustration, I returned to the cabinets to resume my search for something suitable to cook on. I wondered how badly cookies would turn out if baked in a saucepan. Pretty bad, I decided in annoyance. Who the hell doesn't own a cookie sheet? More importantly, how the hell did I ever end up in a house that didn't have one? Just as I was beginning to admit defeat and return to the bedroom to mock my absurd hysterics, Esme walked into the kitchen, still wearing her silk pajamas, with a large box in her arms. Carlyle took it from her, still regarding me with an expression of concern, as he placed it on the counter gingerly. I heard a very distinct clink that alerted me to the contents of the box, and I jumped up from my position on the floor to approach it. Carlyle and Esme both sat beside the counter as I grinned into the box in relief. She had gotten everything I would possibly need to make cookies, and I used my hands to wipe my cheeks clean as I thanked her with embarrassment. She smiled, and ran her fingers through her disheveled hair.
"No problem at all, dear,"
she assured me with a yawn, reaching down to scratch her ankle. I worked fluidly through the kitchen, and they simply watched me with sleepy grins as the silence grew comforting. The echo of the wooden spoon whipping through dough soothed me beyond all comprehension. It was familiar and pacifying. My residual sniffles mingled with the consoling and soft sounds of my placing the dough onto the cookie sheets provided. We waited for them to bake, and neither spoke to me while I watched the door of the oven impatiently. I wasn't accustomed to his appliances, but they were modern and well kept, and I looked forward to using them more. Once I could finally pull them out, I gave one each to Esme and Carlisle. They didn't seem to mind the fact that they were still hot and lacked proper cookie firmness. When I mentioned this, they both laughed at me, but I felt significantly better. I was certain that Dr. Carmen had planted that into my head, and in any other case, I would have felt angered by her role in causing my momentary hysteria. But the empty throbbing of my chest lessened as I took a seat beside the closest people whom I could call my parents, and shared my companionship as best as I could offer. They were both elated when I informed them the following day that I'd much like to see Dr. Carmen again. Maybe going around my elbow to get to my ass wasn't so awful after all. School was to begin only 2 weeks later, and Dr. Carmen had insisted that I participate in at least 2 sessions per week. As our preliminary sessions passed, it was easier to overlook her unorthodox methods and authoritative demeanor with each newly gained insight that I took home to Edward's bedroom. She made me backtrack to my life in Phoenix before the incident, and we gradually worked our way to talking about the particulars of it. She was patient, much like Carlisle, and never voiced any immediate desire to trigger me. She insisted that we go slow and work our way up to anything that difficult. Even though some things were expected, like the small amount of medication I was now administered by Carlisle, she was completely unlike any of my previous therapists, and enjoyed introducing me to untraditional concepts. I was just beginning to exit her office the day before school began when she stopped me with another one of these unconventional ideas. "What?" I asked, dumbfounded as her smile widened and grew into a chuckle.
"I think it would be very effective for you. Nothing over the top, of course, and your instructor will be female."
She shrugged, reaching toward her notepad and making a passing notation while continuing.
"You can choose karate, or just general self-defense. Really, the possibilities of kicking the crap out of a mannequin are endless."
She chuckled once again, and I nodded my agreement, briefly remembering the catharsis of hitting Edward before the throbbing emptiness of my chest overcame me. "That's fine," I replied in a strained voice, before exiting. Really grateful that our session was over and she couldn't discuss that particular reaction just yet. The firmness of her gaze told me that she would eventually, though. I rode to school the next morning with Alice and Jasper. The car was silent and thick with despondency that we were returning 3 people short of our usual circle. The autumn leaves fell around the parking space, where the Volvo should have sat, as we exited the car. The people meandering the halls and quad were oblivious as to the gravity of the day's meaning. I was starting over without Edward. I silently conceded there was no other choice. The emptiness from his absence, though lessened, never ceased. When I drew my hood over my head to begin my soft shuffle to the first class of my senior year, I remembered him. I imagined his arm around my waist, his tender electricity, and his glorious vigilance in keeping me safe and content. But he was gone,